Today we will discuss about top 25 Spring Boot interview questions based on real-time experience as well as freshers. So there are many of the interviewer will ask. These all are the common interview questions related for Spring Boot only. So apart from this, there are also some alternatives interview questions will be there, but this is the very common interview question which will be asked all the interview in this question. So the first question is, what is a Spring Boot? How does it differ from a traditional Spring framework? So we have a Spring framework and a Spring Boot is a features. So what is that and why is it differ from the Spring framework? So these things they will ask. And the next question is, explain the key features of a Spring Boot. What all are the key features are available in a Spring Boot? What are the annotations and most of the features which is implement instead of a Spring framework to a Spring Boot? And the third question is like how do we create a Spring Boot application? Can you provide an example of basic Spring Boot project structures? So how we will create a basic project structures of a Spring Boot. So these things, and then what is the purpose of @Spring Boot application annotation in a Spring Boot? So the fourth question is a Spring Boot application annotations Spring Boot. And then fifth question is, what is a Spring initializer and how can it be used to create a Spring Boot project? So a Spring Boot initializer is there that will be used to create a Spring Boot project. So how we will create by using this? And the next question, sixth question, is difference between embedded container and traditional application server in the context of a Spring Boot. So what is that? Embedded container and traditional application server. So, and the seventh question is like, what is a Spring Boot auto configuration and how does it work? A Spring Boot auto configuration and how does it work? The seventh question is how we will enable or disable a specific Spring Boot auto configuration class. So we have auto configuration class, so how we can disable or enable for the specific requirements and all. The ninth question is, explain the concept of profiling in a Spring Boot. How can we use them in our application? So a Spring Boot profiling is there that will be available in property.yml or application.property, application.yml or application.property. And the 10th question is like, what is the purpose of application.property or application.yml file in a Spring Boot application? How it is used for the configuration? 11th question is, how do you define and use a Spring Bean in a Spring Boot application? So what is a Spring Bean, how you are defining a Spring Bean and all. The next question is, what is a Spring actuator, a Spring Boot actuators, and how and what are the some of the commonly used endpoint provided by it in using actuators. So what is the purpose of a Spring Boot starter? The 13th question is, what is the purpose of a Spring Boot starter and how do we create a custom Spring Boot starter? We can create a custom Spring Boot starter also. And the next question, 14th question, is how you will handle the exception in a Spring Boot. What all are the ways to handle a Spring Boot in excepts? Uh, what are the way to handle the exception in a Spring Boot? And the 15th question is, explain the Spring Boot RESTful web service development process. How we will create a RESTful web services. What all are the ways to create? And then 16th question, what is a Spring Boot data JPA? How can we use to interact with the database? So what all are the ways to interact with database? How we will configure the database? What is JPA? And the 17th question is, how you can secure a Spring Boot application? What all are the available security mechanism? Either maybe JWT, two-factor authentication and all. So what all are the ways are there? And the 18th question is, what is a Spring Boot dev tool and how it does it it is used for the development process. So what is a Spring Boot dev tools, which will be there in the form.xml. You can add the dependency for this and use this. How the 19th question is, how can you integrate a Spring Boot with other technology like a Spring Cloud of microservice developments and all. So what all are the ways to add other technology by using a Spring Boots and all. The 20th question is difference between, discuss the difference between a Spring Boot and a Spring Cloud. What is a Spring Boot? What is a Spring Cloud? What is a Spring Framework and all that things they will ask. And then 21 question is what is a Spring Boot test and how we can write the unit test or integration test in a Spring Boot application. And then 22 question is can you explain the concept of dependency injection in a Spring Boot? Dependency injection in version of control, IOC and all this will be asked. And then the next question is describe the Spring Boot application lifecycle. What is a Spring Boot application lifecycle? Can you describe the same? And the 14th question, 24th fourth question is how can you deploy the Spring Boot application to the production environment? So we have a multiple environment dev test locals and others, so QE and all. So how we will deploy this Spring Boot application in production environment? So what all are the common challenges? 25th question is what are the common challenges and best practice for the Spring Boot application development? So this is the common challenges. They will ask what all are the common challenges for the best practice in Spring Boot development and deployments and all. So these all are the 25th question, total 25 questions which will be available on all the interviewers they may can ask related for freshers and experience in Spring Boot related interview questions.